Despite how terrifying a monster can be, these creatures offer boundless opportunities for development, for strength, and even for logistics and economics. And today, we're going to talk once more about how monsters would change civilizations. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Desks and Dorks. My name is Kyle. I am the Dork. For those of you not in the know, we do indie tabletop role-playing content with a historical bent. I was trained as a medievalist, and today we are delving back into the realms of speculative history to make a video all about how monsters would change and shift the growth of civilizations. But before we get into that, did you know that if you want a rules-light, storytelling heavy experience for pairs of players playing as monsters and the children that have to deal with them, battling against a greater eldritch force, you can get our newest role-playing game online at itch.io. That's right, A Fear Within 2nd edition is right there. But with that out of the way, what are we going to discuss? Today, in general, we are going to be engaging with something called speculative history. That means that I'm going to be using the actual historical training and research that I've done, and I'm going to be applying it to things that are absolutely 1000% not true, right? We all know monsters weren't real. Sorry, not sorry. It is what it is. But it's cool for us as game masters and role-playing game designers and players to consider what would happen if a monster was real. We're going to be doing these things in relation to larger trends in socio-political and socio-economic history. We're going to be talking about how those megafauna might be integrated, and we're going to be ending with specific monsters that you all voted for and how we would use them in our games. If you want to vote on those monsters, the ways that you do that are by joining our Discord or by turning on your post notifications. I literally only take your votes into account when I make some of the parts of these videos, so if you want to make your voice heard, that's the way to do it. And just like last time though, I'm going to be leaning into a more intriguing process here. When I looked at how human beings respond to crisis, a lot of times I talked about that in relation to climate crisis. However, because, monsters are apocalyptic, they're like a giant climate change. However, I think economic crisis also allows us a view onto how human beings would handle apocalyptic or cataclysmic events. And one of our first ways to do that is through trade. It's the classic way of if you can't beat them, you might as well join them. And one of the things that a human could do in relation to the rise of monsters in your society is to engage with trade, either with the monster as the product or with the monster as a trade partner. I need you to consider for a moment that human civilization doesn't just develop naturally, it develops in response to outside stimuli. And in the case of a good trading hub, it usually develops in relation to geographical locations, things like rivers, which allow for navigable trade routes, important trade routes, a coast, again, an important trade route, or access to roads. In a similar way, it's entirely possible that the presence of valuable monsters would cause people to develop civilizations and cities near where those monsters live. Again, if there's one thing that we know about human beings, they're fully capable of and willing to take huge risks for a massive payday. I mean, after all, we put don't mix alcohol and caffeine together on Red Bull cans, and then we turned around and put them with Jägermeister to make Jaeger bombs. We are not a species built to last, particularly when the money is good. It's entirely plausible, too, that human beings in a world full of monsters would develop a need for monsters as a trade good, in the same way that people have developed an illegal trade good for things like rhinoceros and elephant ivory. These goods don't really have a lot of practical purpose anymore, but in some cases still serve as great vanity products. And again, those vanity products are worth risking your life and your limb for to some people. This is especially true in economically depressed or in areas where there is a lack of upward social mobility. If your options are the slums or fighting and duking it out with some sort of toothy beast, there's more than a few people I know that would take that chance. After all, there's still people that think somehow that 100 regular guys would beat a gorilla. I don't know how that even would work, right? But as I mentioned, it's entirely possible that parts of a monster become valuable, and that as a result of that, it changes the way that your civilization grows and develops. One of our lovely commenters pointed out, for example, that a hydra, something that is able to constantly regenerate its tissue, could be used as a potentially useful and viable source of meat. Imagine for a moment a hydra hunting ground where you let the hydras free range roam, and every so often you send in hunting fishing teams to take out a hydra, or at least to injure a hydra, insofar as it doesn't grow massively, so you're not like putting everybody in danger. But it'd be interesting that like free range hydra could be a potential source of your next stake. Imagine a hydra regulatory board or a council of town merchants that make sure that the free-range grazing practices of the hydras in the local nature preserve are within the usual legal guidelines, and that hydra meat is being prepared effectively and efficiently so that it doesn't regrow inside the eater's stomach. This is the kind of stuff that a human in a world where monsters are maybe not common, but around, might think of if you're in a low fantasy setting. Remember, humans in the ancient world, in the medieval world, they're not dumb. They'll apply good logic, and if they see an angle, they will take it. What about things like dragons? Even a dragon who is potentially very, very dangerous. And we're talking about dragons not as the sentient, shape-changing deities or beings in things like Chinese mythology or South Korean mythology, or as one of the commenters pointed out, in Eastern European and Slavic mythology as well, which I didn't realize there were a couple sentient dragons floating around Slavic folklore, which is cool. But we're not talking about those. We're talking about the dragon as a large, fire-breathing megafauna, a creature that is exceptionally deadly, yes, and dangerous, of course, but not like a thinking, breathing being. Why might a human try to go and engage with one of these guys? Well, it's because dragon fangs, dragon scales make for the most effective arms and armor on the continent. Imagine, for example, in a world where iron or bronze is the prevailing metal of choice, having something that is essentially like super titanium, a king who has a sword that can cut through armor with ease, or has a shield that can deflect anything short of a catapult boulder or a ballista bolt, is somebody who would be an actual threat. And weapons like that to protect important figures, figures of state like a king or an emperor, or important religious figures like the leader of faith, a pope, for example, are always going to be worth their weight in gold. And there are going to be people who are willing to pay for that advantage. Means it's worth, working your way in gold for. Again, sea serpents as well might provide an excellent either contributor away from trade or a contribution to trade. A small local fishing village, when faced with a choice of starvation or taking down a leviathan whose meat might be able to last them not just for a year, but for several years or several seasons, if your options are the slow death of you and everybody that you love due to starvation and exposure, or you and every single able-bodied person in the village taking on a massive hunt, I think it's totally worth it. And in fact, the idea of hunting megafauna like this for potential trade goods is something that already exists within the Neolithic eras of history, right? We know that groups of humans who were, again, in terms of strength, inferior to their woolly mammoth, compatriots would still be willing to engage in battle and organize technique against something like that, specifically because the meat and hide would allow larger communities to survive. I have no doubt that a community, even one that is terrified and knows that it's outclassed, if had their backs to the wall, would be willing to face down something quite like one of these leviathans. Remember, if your options are kick up around the campfire with a brewski and talk about how cool it was that you guys slaughtered a kraken, or be unalived by the forces of nature and the raw power of human starvation, you're probably going to pick the former, no matter how terrifying the latter is. And again, the idea that making arms or armor of those exotic things is something that could lead to the development of a civilization or town, city, fort, whatever. Imagine for a moment that a local group of fishermen is able to turn leviathan teeth and scales into powerful weapons. Maybe less powerful than dragon scales, in this fictional world that we're making up, but they're more plentiful and they're easier to get access to because, maybe these are small leviathans. Think like the size of an orca rather than the size of a continent. Over time, as I hit my notes, those fishermen would grow and develop a prosperous town and fishing village on the back of the things that they trade and on the abilities of what they are trading for. These are important things to consider when talking about how human beings respond to something that is of incredible power, kind of like a monster. But if anything, the power of a monster, the development of a great creature like that, is kind of like the development of and the power of international trade factors. Again, those shift civilizations a lot, and in many ways, trade mirrors monsters. Also, let's talk about this for a moment, but it doesn't even have to be practical, right? I referenced rhinos and elephants at the beginning of the video, but people think that like a rhino tusk is like an aphrodisiac. There's a black market for this thing, even though that absolutely is not true. People are willing to pay for ridiculously dumb crap. I would know. I lived through the 90s. I know what Tamagotchis and Pogs are. Do you know how startling it is to tell an 8-year-old kid that you paid for and collected cardboard discs by choice? That's a bizarre thing that everyone can just kind of be like, why did we do that? But human beings have been paying for and continue to pay for dumb crap all the time. So yes, your human is willing to risk themselves for survival, for shelter, for profit, but that profit can come because you're making things that just don't make any sense or selling monster parts that have no real use otherwise. I'm going to give a shout out as well, by the way, to the Kenyan and to the South African Ranger forces, who, by the way, this I believe is the Kenyan Ranger Force, staged these pictures of them burning tons of confiscated black market ivory as a statement to say this is what's going to happen to the fortunes of poachers who take advantage of the wildlife, who slaughter what are basically sentient animals. Fun fact, by the way, African elephants have the same level of emotional intelligence and communication ability as like a 4 to 6 year old human. That's wild. What are we doing? They also have memories, and they're one of the few animals that can die of heartbreak. Fun fact. But I just thought these were absolutely hard. Like, look at this. These are the hardest pictures I think I've ever seen. But they're proof that humans now and humans in the past would be more than willing to pay for dumb crap. Seriously, imagine like the medieval equivalent of a Labubu doll and the kind of things that you would have for it. Like 1 second you're fighting an ogre, and then the next second you're turning its tendons into something that you're going to sell to a nobleman's child for like a literal sack of diamonds. It's so dumb, but human beings can be dumb, and we are willing to risk life and limb for dumb things if we think they'll make us a profit, or if we think they'll give us social status. Yes, I am aware the Labubu doll is dumb. However, it is no more dumb than, I don't know, let's say medieval European nobles getting illegally sourced narwhal horns, passing them off as unicorn horns and displaying them as status symbols, or something like Victorian Englishmen renting pineapples. If you were a middle-class English person, you could rent a pineapple as a status symbol. In some cases, these would ride around in carriages with you to prove how much social clout and wealth that you had. People are stupid. We will sometimes pay for stupid things. It is the duality of man. Sometimes ancient man is smart, sometimes ancient man is dumb, but as a wise person once told me, humans gonna human. But it's not just trading that is an impressive response to, the things like monsters. Sometimes humans, even when faced evidence that they are against a physically superior force, will attempt to raid and fight it anyway. And over time, what might be interesting is they'll realize that some monsters probably do help them with this, right? Imagine being the first person, for example, to bond with a horse and use that horse to help you out. Most likely probably would have been the Scythians, although there's some cases to say that it's somewhere within the mountainous regions of China, near where the Mongols would be, that has evidence of this. And this makes sense, by the way. Early horses, smaller musculature, so it probably would have been a woman or at least a young man, a child, perhaps a teenager, who was the first ones to start riding those horses. But again, animals like horses and camels have been, maybe particularly frightening at the beginning of time, but over years of domestication and a relationship with people, don't just become things that you can raid against, but become tools to help the human being raid just a little bit more. We have talked in our Bronze Age video, for example, about things like the donkeys in the Sumerian war carts that were basically just ticked off, sources of the engine that, pushed forward the Sumerian war machine. If you weren't going to get hit by the long bronze spears or long bronze poleaxes of the charioteers, you could get bitten, stomped, or kicked to, the state of unalivement by a bunch of angry Sumerian donkeys. These are great examples of how human beings would train, develop, and grow alongside creatures outside of their own existence. And perhaps that could be the relationship with monsters as well. Perhaps no greater example of this in history than that of the elephant, which we just talked about. But the war elephant is seen in many cases, especially if you read the writings of people who fought with and against war elephants in antiquity, but these are kind of seen as the ancient super weapon, right? This is, imagine you're just from some random city-state and you're up against what is essentially a nuke on legs. You watch this thing crush one of your friends, you watch it run through entire embankments of soldiers, and now, elephants don't necessarily want to charge through a large embankment of sharp stuff. No living being wants to harm itself on purpose, but if you startle it, if you scare it, and it starts attacking, oh boy, you are in for a world of hurt. And monsters could be used as mounts, but I'm far more interested in how humans would develop military partnerships in other ways. For example, instead of mounts, what if we found a race of canine-like monster that has pack tactics like a wolf, but is smaller, more aggressive, but still able to and willing to be trained? Why wouldn't we use them like war dogs, essentially setting them upon enemy formations to break apart lines right before a charge takes place, kind of like the Roman war dogs would have been used? Or what if we find something like a hippocampus or the hippocampi from Greek myth and legend? Things that, despite being kind of a horrific looking sea beast, if we're being honest, still share a lot of their common DNA with horses, which means they can be domesticated. But why not turn those hippocampi into sources to guard shipping lanes from pirates or to escort ships through choppy waters and around rock formations? A manticore seems to be, by most myth and legend, a very territorial creature, but not one that's going to burn down an entire civilization or destroy an entire city. It might pose a danger to a small town, which is perfect, for example, if you are willing to let the manticore live in an area that you want protected. Imagine for a moment you have no great geological or geographic protection, things to wall off an oncoming or approaching force. Having a manticore or three in a badlands section of your territory to prevent them from coming in, prevent them from battling you and finding you, is a great idea and a great concept. Again, it's entirely possible that human beings, resourceful as we are going to venture on and create relationships with monsters of a reasonable intelligence who are willing to work with us, either intentionally through domestication or perhaps just through simple coexistence, kind of like our manticore right here. So we have trade, we have raid, but what about raise? How would the cultivation of a monster create and make a civilization a little bit better? For this to work, we have to consider two very different creatures and the relationships they have with human beings. The first one is fictional. It's the Nemean lion. In many ways, perhaps one of Hercules' most impressive feats, the destruction of and slaying of a beast that is literally indestructible, can't be pierced, can't be stabbed, can't be crushed, but it can basically be strangled, right? Which is how he takes care of it. But the reason the Nemean lion is so important is because it has something that is incredibly, widely desirable. Its coat, the kind of armor that would protect from anything, a nigh indestructible suit of mail forged by Mother Nature and made so light that it was easy to move around and battle against. Armed with that fur, Heracles isn't just a threat anymore, he's a menace. And again, he was already kind of a menace before, but it goes to show you what you can do if there's something that you need from a creature. But again, there's only one Nemean lion. You can't equip an army with a Nemean lion, which is why we turn to our second animal, our second important creature, the humble mule. Something that not a lot of people tend to know is the mule isn't its own animal. It's actually a domesticated crossbreed between a donkey and a horse. It was a way to get the positive traits of both of those animals onto the farm. It's important for us to make note of this because, well, it leads to domestication and genetic modification, two things that human beings have been doing basically since there were human beings. We did it before with things like wild plants that we would over time breed, cross-pollinate to get the desirable traits, and we did it again with the mule. We wanted the traits of both of those animals so badly that we were willing to crossbreed over long periods of time to get the animal to be what it is. Now, you might be asking yourself, what does this have to do with the Nemean lion? Imagine for a moment human beings figure out that the Nemean lion exists, right? They're unable to destroy it because they are not Heracles, they're not Hercules, they're not able to do the thing they need to do. So what they do is they leave the land alone. They establish a pattern, they know where the Nemean lion is going to roam around and how it is going to operate. However, a human gets a really interesting idea. We have lions from other places, lionesses. What if we were to say, I don't know, bring a regular lion into the Nemean lion's territory? And what if we, risky though it may be, tracked her movements and to see if the Nemean lion would reproduce? Could that reproduction, could that coupling create a lion whose coat is perhaps very strong, a kind of ancient Kevlar, a bulletproof vest, ancient mithril, if you really want to call it that, but is able to be, destroyed via the usual methods that we would take out an animal? Over time, could we crossbreed and create a lesser version of the Nemean lion, keeping it in a single area, and then use its actual natural gifts to make powerful armor? Again, not armor on par with the actual Nemean lions, but armor that would again lend a tactical and professional advantage to a soldier, to a fighting force, or to a king or queen. These are the kinds of things that I want you to think about. Human beings are willing to risk everything, risk all manner of horrific things to gain an advantage, whether that advantage is through money, through military, through religion, or politics. And so the monster, as it would cause civilization to develop, isn't necessarily a problem to solve all of the time. Sometimes it is an opportunity that has yet to be explored, and perhaps the idea of using a crossbreeded lower version of a Nemean lion to make ancient Kevlar could be the way that one of your military city-states in your campaign world grows, develops, and changes. But now we turn our attention to how we would use some very specific monster types in our games. And as always, join the Discord or put the post notifications on so that you can vote in what monsters get selected or what topics we cover in videos like these. The first one that won, however, is the Fae, and this is a pretty wide-ranging topic, a pretty umbrella term for the sort of mystical creatures that roamed around Europe, but specifically in places like Ireland and Scotland. The Fae have a very long-ranging and sort of esoteric reputation. There's a lot of folklore, a lot of legends, and a lot of interesting and intriguing things about them, but I think one of the most, at least for me, intriguing things about the Fae is that they're secretive, they're sentient, and they have tons of powers. This means that a peaceful coexistence is entirely unlikely, as they are incredibly motivated, and if you can judge by any amount of the folklore, those motivations are less than savory a lot of the time. Their powers and their organization make it unlikely that they're willing to cooperate for long periods of time, and eventually humans are going to come to blows with them. Peaceful coexistence with the Fae is unfortunately not an option, not any way that you slice it. It's not like the Neanderthals and the early Homo sapiens who actually did bond together. Actually, they coexisted. There's a lot of really interesting shall we say, anthropological study going on right now about the relationship between Homo sapien and Neanderthal, and apparently we just cooperated for so long. Eventually, the Neanderthal strain got incorporated into the Homo sapien one, which is pretty cool. That's not going to happen here. We are going straight to war with the fairies, and in fact, Artemis Fowl, the book series, not this abomination. It will be a cold day in hell before I ever recognize the Artemis Fowl live action adaptations. No, the books do a pretty good job at incorporating what a society of fairies would look like as it comes to blows with a society of humans. It's entirely plausible, I think, in this book especially, where it does a great job of pointing this out, that the fairies, with their wide range of abilities and organization, would most likely develop parallel to human beings in a way that sort of separates the Fae from us. And in fact, this is actually echoed in Celtic folklore as well, with the fairies actually battling against various Celtic kings and Celtic heroes of myth and legend. But how could we use that in our games? How could we use that to develop or help build our own game worlds and our players' understanding of the dangers of the Fae as it stands? Well, my friends, in order for us to do that, we really have to talk about nukes. Yes, that's right. There's a lot more in common with a nuclear bomb and the Fae than you might think, and that, I think, comes in the form of cultural understanding. You see, if the Fae are able to remain hidden, which in most folklores and most folkloric adaptations they are, that means that human beings who encounter them have to enshrine the knowledge of how to battle a Fae over long periods of time, where there's lots of folks who may or may not believe that those creatures exist in your game world, right? And how do you do that? Well, that actually goes back to our friends the nukes. One of the things that human beings right now and human researchers are trying to study is how do we preserve the dangers of both the proliferation of nuclear weapons and the long-term dangerous effects of radiation itself. And one of the ways that humans are trying to do this right now is by enshrining teachings and doctrines about radiation into organized religion. This is already happening, by the way, in places like Russia, where they have Orthodox priests literally blessing nuclear weapons, or at least missile silos, and in some services calling them our protector angels. Weirdly enough, if you have played Warhammer at all, that sort of religious thinking plays really heavily into stuff like the tech priests or the space marines in general, right? The idea of enshrining certain beliefs so that they stay a long time within religious doctrine is a real historical tactic that people use to preserve knowledge over long periods of time. And I mean, think about it from your perspective, right? Think about your society. What if you were, saying to enshrine knowledge about fairies in things that kids would learn about from a very early age, poems and nursery rhymes? And what if you, instead put fairies and certain elements about them into popular culture, things that the TikTok girlies would really love with their dark gray shadow man romances? And what if instead you even put things like iron, the thing that a fairy is weak against, into stuff like your breakfast cereal, helping to make you far more effective against resisting fairy magic? Now, this is the part where I tell you that I'm not saying that Cinnamon Toast Crunch is a psyop to help us battle against the Fae, but I'm also saying Cinnamon Toast Crunch might be a psyop to help us battle against Oberon. That's all I'm gonna point out, right? But these are little silly ways, right? Obviously I'm joking, but these are silly ways that you, or that a society, could potentially bake in an understanding of a nearly mythical force and enshrine it in such a way that even if you laugh and you call it pop culture or pop media, you're still learning important lessons about how to battle against those creatures. I think that's kind of funny. I'm not saying fairies exist. I'm not saying that Cinnamon Toast Crunch is our secret weapon against them, but there's a reason that we still don't know why kids love the taste. That's all I'm going to point that out. But now, my friends, to talk about other things we need to point out, let's talk about giant arachnids and giant insects in general, and how we could use those dark and terrifying giant insects in our games. And just like we mentioned in the last video, where I pointed out that your mom had a really great statement about, the size of a dragon mattering, because as your mom pointed out, size does matter. Size matters a ton here for these large insects. But before we go on, I'm gonna stop for a second. As some of you pointed out, spiders aren't insects. Spiders are arthropods, and technically speaking, a spider is an animal, right? That makes tons of sense. But look, here's the thing, man. In traditional board game parlance, right, we just call these giant insects. Obviously, and I know that a spider is an arthropod, not an insect, and thus a spider is an animal just like you or me. But come on, man, we all know what we're talking about here, and of course this giant spider does get lumped in with the other giant insects in terms of this. And I'm gonna put this disclaimer in right now because I don't really feel like getting actually a lot in the comments. And actually, while we're on that topic, your mom wanted me to bring this up because, yeah, those of you who keep pointing that out over and over again, you are right. You are technically correct, and of course that's the best kind of correct, but your mom's a little bit worried about you. You know, that level of pedantry, she's worried that that's going to stop you from making friends and forging longer lasting relationships. And really, she wants you to succeed, right? She knows that you're right, and you know that you're right, and I know that you're right. And again, the spider is technically an arthropod, but I'm going to keep calling it an insect because at the end of the day, you, me, our players, and the GMs watching this video, we all know what it is. We all know that we're just talking about big, giant, creepy, crawly bugs for a role-playing game. But she just wanted me to tell you that, and you know, she's worried about you, and she really wants you to, I don't know, succeed, and maybe call her at some point. Because Lord knows I'm not going to call her. You could call me Danny Phantom the way this woman's about to get ghosted. Alright, moving on. Now, let's talk a little bit about giant insects and their importance in a fantasy role-playing game. And I think this actually delves back into our idea of raising things as a response to large predatory animals or to animals that could be potentially beneficial to us. It's easy for us to say that, oh, well, you know, we'll just deal with the insects the way that we would deal with any large predatory animal. We will find the places that they live, we will cordon those places off, and then eventually we will absolutely deal with those with the most prejudice possible. But again, think about our Nemean lion example. Think about all of the different animals that are potentially really dangerous that you and I take for granted right now in the modern era. And here's the thing, the truth is that insects are incredibly valuable and incredibly useful for a number of different things. In the drow settings, or in settings where the dark elves are common, spider silk equipment, clothing, structures, all of those things play a big role in the development of the drow world. And that's fairly common. That makes a ton of sense. It's a big trope, but as cool as the armor is, what about the impact that giant spider silk might have on things like the textile industry or on architecture in general? Imagine spider silk structures, giant suspension bridges held aloft by manually harvested spider silk from giant spiders that over time develop symbiotically alongside their mortal captors and mortal, people. Who knows, over a couple thousand years, what would happen if a human being or a human race was able to, I don't know, say genetically modify or at least evolve alongside giant insects. I mean, already we know, for example, bees generate more honey if they know that they have a beekeeper. It's something that they actually do over time. This could be something that maybe the giant spider or those giant bees do, where they generate more of the material that we need from them over a period of time. And that could totally change and shape the way technology, architecture, and science develops, because as much as we're loath to admit it, the chemicals inside of insects often have amazing uses, both in science and in pharmaceuticals. This means that if you're having a civilization that grows alongside the giant insect, there's a ton of potentially valuable body parts or chemical components to be harvested from those creatures over long periods of time. One of my favorite examples of this is the bullet ant that lives in the rainforest. And the bullet ant's sting is incredibly painful, but what we've found is the chemicals and the act and pain of that sting are able to trigger an adrenal response in human beings. It's essentially like literally going into a kind of berserker rage where that adrenaline spike literally hits and suddenly you're able to run at incredible speeds or lift a car or do all of the things that human adrenaline can carry forward for you. Imagine having access as a military to chemical components harvested from the giant insects that your empire has spent forever cultivating, and using that adrenaline-fueled drug to essentially force your warriors into a constant, permanent, upgraded berserker state. That would be very terrifying and could be a really compelling world-building hook if you're going to engage with that as an actual angle. But it brings me now to my favorite things of all, which are the sea monsters. Look, in the last video that we did, I had to censor a whole bunch of nymph titties, and in this video, I had to engage with my biggest fear other than spiders, which is my thalassophobia. I am horrified of giant sea monsters. We have talked about this at length at Desks and Dorks, but I look at the ocean and I say, yes, I like you to an extent, but once we get out to a certain distance in the water, I want nothing to do with it. Mariana Trench? Nope. More like Mariana, get the heck away from me, wench. Don't want it. But I think the idea of a sea monster is incredibly compelling because of the impact that these giant aquatic creatures would certainly have on the game world. Now, the big question, I think, if we're talking about how the human beings and the human race might respond in a low fantasy setting to creatures like this is entirely based on whether the sea serpent is sentient or not, right? If it is an unthinking, unfeeling thing, I think it goes on the same way that stuff like the whaling trade went on for a number of years. If you want a fantastic game that delves into this, plus a little bit of a Christian horror as well, because your eternal damnation is spent finding and fighting these giant whales, Hell Whalers is a fantastic role-playing game, one of the coolest ones that I've seen. But I really do think historically it would go something along like that, right? What are orcas and, giant blue whales, if not leviathans right now? What are giant squids or other aquatic beasts that human beings have encountered over the years, if not kind of leviathans? And I don't think it's too far-fetched in a low fantasy world to say that yes, the risk might be there, but I think human societies would still develop in a pretty usual track or usual way. It might be more casualties, it might force additional technological developments forward, but I think in general, the human is going to deal with and battle against the quote-unquote non-sentient Leviathan in ways that are pretty standard for how we've dealt with the big sea creatures in our current plane of existence. Now, that changes entirely based on the size and on the sentience. If the monsters can think, that is an entirely different concept. And I talked about trade earlier and how monsters could not just be potential objects to trade, but also be potential allies for or beneficiaries of that trade. It is entirely plausible, I think, that should creatures of that level of power and sentience be a real thing, once communication becomes possible, I think trade agreements with them are actually inevitable at that point, right? We are assuming that the sea serpent here has a level of sentience equivalent to a human's. There is nothing to say that those sea serpents wouldn't develop technologically and culturally in the same ways that human beings would. And it's actually really interesting, kind of echoes some of the biblical stories and biblical parable lessons that go along with it. But like the idea that the mortals control the land, which the Leviathans could potentially need. Lots of cool stuff on land that you could get access to. And the Leviathans control the sea means that there's a really interesting symbiotic relationship that could evolve as a result of that, right? Trade, more so than almost anything else, seems to be a big driving factor, both for societal development and for cultural development. And it would be really interesting, I think, to consider that maybe citizens on the coast or civilizations on the coast might have a closer working relationship with the Leviathans in your game world, as opposed to those that live inland. Maybe the ones inland tell horror stories about the Leviathans, and they whisper about them in hushed tones, and then when they get to the coast and they meet one of the Leviathans, the people at town are like, oh yeah, that's Chuck. Chuck brings in several hundred tons of seaweed every week, and in exchange, we give him belly rubs and bring him oranges. It could be something like that. I think there's a real reasonable case to be made if the humans cannot obliterate this society, that they're going to have to trade with them. And then once you start trading, once you start having to coexist by force, in this case, the force of neither side has the ability to destroy the other, that's when some really cool cultural development starts. And I genuinely think that that's how that would go. But that's not entirely it, because there is the real Leviathan, and I almost poorly photoshopped a picture of Slim Shady over the Leviathan's face. But we have to talk about the real Leviathan. This art is horrifying. Oh my god, I hate it. But this is the biblical depiction of the Leviathan. The Leviathan is a creature of Hebrew myth and legend. You can find stories about him in the biblical book of Leviticus, which is kind of important. But essentially, I'm going to paraphrase this legend. The Leviathan is a immortal, indestructible sea serpent with an incredible intelligence and a penchant for evil. It is a hideously evil beast that God himself has decided to make indestructible. And if that is the case, right, there are two Leviathans, he destroys its mate and then makes it indestructible and immortal as punishment and penance. It has to spend the rest of its existence mourning the fact that it is alone. And while that might be objectively horrifying and lonely for the Leviathan, it's probably objectively worse for the rest of humanity. If you're up against this kind of sea serpent, the only thing that you could potentially do is contain it, either through sleep magic. Maybe you can trap it in a psychic loop where it relives its best day over and over again, like some sort of Twilight Zone episode, or maybe you just never go into the water ever again. And that would be a really interesting world. Imagine a world where 70% of it is water, like ours, but the ocean is off limits because somebody decided to give the world's most evil creature immortality and indestructibility and free reign over 70% of the planet. That would change a lot about how a civilization would develop. And honestly, I think that's a really cool backdrop for a game. That's a free one. Y'all can have that one. Or maybe I'll do it too. Who knows? But I think that's definitely one of the more interesting ones. And I also love, by the way, that these early Jewish depictions of the Leviathan, or in this case, the whale that swallows Jonah from the Old Testament. I thought those were pretty cool. But it goes to show that our fear of and intrigue of massive sea beasts has been going on for a long time. But my good friends, that does bring us to the end of this video. If you like the work that we do here and you want to get a unique role-playing game you can't get anywhere else, I would encourage you to join our Patreon. $10 a month, you get your own game. I did a 15-page dungeon crawl classic anthology adventure for this month's patrons. I'm not saying I do that every month, but I kind of cooked this month. So if you want a really cool RPG every month you can't buy anywhere else, that's the single best place to do it. This link will take you to our itch.io store, where you can get PDFs of all of our amazing role-playing games, and Tabletop Bookshelf has physical copies of A Fear Within effective at the time of this recording. That means if you're like, I like A Fear Within, but rather than spend the money on a PDF, I'd rather just spend the full amount on a physical book and the PDF so I have something to show for it. Totally understandable. Tabletop Bookshelf, the link is in the description below. You can get a physical copy of A Fear Within 2nd edition from them, which I think is really awesome. But of course you can get our other stuff from Indie Press Revolution and Exalted Funeral, our 2 other big partners. But speaking of partners, I have to end the video off by saying thank you to my amazing patrons, Dionysus, Chris Bates, Agile Monk, Aiden Delaney, Brian, Gorbino the Great, Solution, Alex.vksh, Papa Dinosaur, and Chromatic Orbital Strike. You guys are absolutely amazing. Thank you all so much for helping me out and for allowing me to continue to do videos like this one. If you are interested in our Q&A section, that will be in the Patreon, which means I will be answering questions about this topic from the Desks and Dorks Discord. But until next time, I am Kyle Ott for Desks and Dorks. You have been absolutely amazing. I'll see you in the next one. Peace.